Father of the nation. Please welcome Richard Sorabji, Charles DeSalvo, and Ananya Vajpayee in conversation with Faisal Devji. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for attending in such large numbers. Can you hear me? Can people hear me at the back? No, not now? Okay, excellent. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers who will be narrowly questioned by me shortly. Professor Richard Sorabji, the eminent philosopher, formerly of King's College London, whose latest book is called Gandhi and the Stoics. Dr. Ananya Vajpayee, whose recent, very well-received book, Righteous Republic, deals with political thinking in India, the history of political thought in India. She's a fellow at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi. And Professor Charles DeSalvo from the University of West Virginia, professor of law, author of a very substantial recent book, The Man Behind the Mahatma, on Gandhi as a lawyer. So without further ado, let me begin. And I'd like to begin by saying how interesting it is to me, at least, that Gandhi, to my knowledge, is the only major political figure of the 20th century who rejects history entirely, whose thought is not based on history. Unlike imperialism, for instance, which was premised upon a gradual evolution, the gradual evolution of freedom among the Indian people, a freedom that would eventually be granted by the British in the fullness of time. Unlike communism, which of course has a kind of telos of a dictatorship of the proletariat, followed by communism and the withering of the state. Unlike every political ideology we know of the 20th century, Gandhianism, if there is such a thing, really has no history. It rejects history as being violent. For Gandhi, violence was made possible because it subjected ends, it subjected means to ends. You could sacrifice the means for the ends. And turning to Richard, it strikes me that your book too, in a way, performs Gandhi's rejection of history, insofar as you put together Gandhi with Stoicism, a philosophy of antiquity and of late antiquity. I wonder if you might say something about the way in which what you are doing is also somehow taking up Gandhi's challenge to think non-historically, or to think about the philosophical as opposed to the historical dimension of politics.
Now, is the microphone reaching to the back end there? Can you hear all right? At the back, is it all right? Is it all right? I'm not getting any no's. Good. Well, that's a very interesting question, because Gandhi, once he'd gone to London, read extremely widely. And everything he read, he transformed. He loved certain parts of Christianity, he loved certain Christian writers, but he changes them all. He loved Plato. He paraphrased a whole work of Plato, but he changed it. Everything he touched, he changed. He actually only discovered the Stoics late in life, and he thought they were wonderful. But because he discovered them late in life, he didn't have time to change them. And so, by a funny result, he remained much closer in spirit to the Stoics, in my view, than to the people he'd actually paraphrased, like Tolstoy and Plato. Because he was forever changing them. And that's, of course, is unhistorical, but wonderfully enlightening. Because you finish up with something which isn't Plato, which isn't Tolstoy, but is richer than either of them. I think it fits with his idea, he takes them to the Jains, that nobody has the full picture of truth. And so we're all looking for truth, and he's got a unique combination. Philosophically, I think it's very useful. Historically, it's no good at all. But it wasn't meant to be historical.
I think, just to follow up on that, so what in fact you're doing in your book, one of the many things you do, is to create a sense of intimacy between two forms of thought which are historically very distinct, Gandhi's nonviolence and Stoicism. And it struck me when I was reading your book how Gandhi himself worked with the idea that opposites are intimate to each other. So for him, in my view, violence and non-violence are actually very close to each other. It's only because they are intimate with each other that one can become the other. In other words, a violent person can become non-violent precisely because he or she knows the other. The two are intimate. I'll give you a little example and then ask you what you think of this intimacy. So, for instance, in Gandhi's famous commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, he notes that otherwise virtuous and noble figures like Karna, like Bhishma, like Drona, fought for the wrong side, all right, fought for the Kauravas. And one reason why they did that, he says, is because they were actuated by goodness, not by evil. So they fought out of promises rendered, out of friendship, out of loyalty. All of these, Gandhi says, are virtues, indubitable virtues. And it allows him to then say that even evil is based upon goodness, because the evil Prince Duryodhana cannot himself control his own men. He can only rely upon their goodness. Right? He's unable to fully control them. They are not fighting for him because they are evil. They are fighting for him out of their own goodness. The question that arises here is, if the intimacy between violence and non-violence is what allows one to convert into the other, and Gandhi focuses on violence converting into non-violence, is not the opposite also possible? Is it not possible for non-violence to become violence? And how do you think Gandhi might, if he does indeed, deal with this reverse possibility? And do the Stoics have anything to tell us about it?
Well, I think I take a different view on the reverse movement. It's familiar to me, the idea that evil depends on goodness. It occurs in the ancient Greek Neoplatonists, but Gandhi didn't know those. I think it's much more difficult to argue the other way around, that goodness depends on evil. And I don't actually take that view about Gandhi on non-violence. We probably take slightly different views. I expect all of us take slightly different views on this, but I'll tell you what my view was. It was this, that on non-violence, Gandhi looks inconsistent, but actually, in order to see that he is remarkably consistent, in my view, not totally, but remarkably consistent, at least up to 1940, you have to understand the philosophy behind it, which is what's like Stoicism. Let me just develop that a little bit. Gandhi thinks that non-violence is not an invariable rule except in one respect. There's one thing that's invariably true about violence. It is always wrong, no exception. That sounds very absolute. But now, look at how he makes it vary. It's always wrong, he says, but there may be something else which is even more wrong. He wrote the most wonderful set of 7 letters in 1926. They're not in the collected works, in which he supported the killing of 60 potentially rabid dogs. This produced outrage from his readers. I'm saying Gandhi is a wonderful philosopher, and one reason why he is wonderful is that all his decisions were based on experiments. What do we do with dangerous animals in the ashram or in a city? And then public discussion, in which he always published the objections of people who were against him, and then in response developed far deeper and learned from the objections. This is already one ideal that philosophers should follow. I think he's a model in that respect. But he's a model because the resulting view was very, very subtle and seldom understood by philosophers. After he had said that violence is always wrong, he said that non-violence may be even more wrong. So you may be in a double bind, a moral double bind. Whichever way you go is wrong, and so you've got to decide which is worse. Now, I think Greek tragedy understood that. He didn't know Greek tragedy. I think some Christian thinkers, but only a few, understood that. Gandhi understood it. Sometimes, whether you do it or whether you don't do it, violence, you're wrong either way. You've got to see which is worse in the situation. And he had a number of different reasons why it shouldn't be the same decision for everybody. Because he thought that in making decisions in life, and this is very, very stoic, in making decisions in life, it's not enough just to think, well, at least I must be rational because humans are rational. That's only the beginning. You've got to think who you are as an individual. And for example, if you have agreed to be in charge of a township because you're on the city council, then you have acquired a duty to protect the residents from rabid dogs. This duty would not necessarily fall on somebody who hadn't undertaken the post of municipal council or head of the council. So what roles you've undertaken is one thing. Or again, your beliefs. He thought that the Ali brothers believed that the right thing was not non-violence but retaliation. Well, in that case, it would be even worse for them to follow Gandhi just to please Gandhi, because they'd be going against their own beliefs, which is even worse. Of course, they're terribly wrong. Any violence they perform is wrong. They are completely mistaken. The best would be for them to understand that violence is wrong. But if they don't understand that, it's better for them to be violent in doing what they believe. Or just one more example. He said to Hindu tradesmen on the Afghan frontier, when you're attacked by Afghan raiders, don't run away, which is what I would do. Don't run away, he said. That's cowardice. You Hindu tradesmen have got to learn courage, so shoot back. Because they've got a different character. They should learn something of the fearlessness of the Afghan raiders and drop something of the quiet life wanted by the Hindu traders. So your character, your undertakings, all these things mean that there'll be different decisions for different people in different circumstances. That is very, very stoic. I think it's true. It's rarely perceived in philosophy. And so to a large extent, I don't agree with people like Perry Anderson who say Gandhi is forever inconsistent. That's how it appears, because he's telling different people, you can be violent, you shouldn't be violent. Looks inconsistent. It's the philosophy of the individual, which the Stoics shared, which mean that it's not inconsistent, but you won't see that until you understand this individualistic philosophy behind it. I do admit that from in the 1940s, I think he did become rather inconsistent, especially with Quit India, where he says, we won't get rid of the British till doomsday. I think he was beginning to feel despair, acting a bit out of his previous character, I think. I think it was, to my mind, a slight failing, but a failing in a giant. I know you have a different view, and I think we all, I have no different view for you. We may have different views, but this will come out later.
Well, I think that I much prefer the Gandhi of the 1940s, actually. The Gandhi who, for very interesting reasons, is for the war with Pakistan in 1948. But his reasons are fascinating. I won't go into it now. But turning to Ananya, I think, Ananya, the two of us as historians, returning to this theme of history, here we're writing about a man who rejected explicitly history, who recommended forgetting rather than remembering, for whom the traditional, if you will, conception of exiting the chain of birth and rebirth seems to serve as a metaphor for rejecting the historical causality itself. Do you think we are betraying him in some sense? Is it possible to write history, to view Gandhi as a historical figure without betraying his thought in some sense?
Well, I mean, honestly, I don't think that as historians we are betraying him to the degree to which he is betrayed by the entire project of state building and nation building. So, I mean, you and I are hardly the worst offenders in this regard. I think, I mean, all of us here take him very seriously as a thinker, and we try to look at his political thought in the context of his political practice and his historical adventures. That's not the same as, you know, assigning to him some kind of historicism or a desire to make history, to be a historical actor in the way that he certainly never sought. I think it's ironic that, you know, we, and by we I mean, you know, Indians, we call him the father of our nation, and that we think of it as a form of honor to him that we would want to speak about him on our Republic Day. This is ironic, this is tragic to my mind, because you know, he had a very different vision in mind for the kind of values he wanted to see realized in our collective life as a society. He had very different things in mind in terms of the goals of social transformation and social uplift. And in as much as we proceed as a certain kind of nation state and a certain kind of society, we are almost always going against the Gandhian vision. So you know, I wouldn't feel any particular guilt for putting Gandhi back in history. I mean, he is part of our history, but his perspective on history is a different issue. You know.
You know, I'm really pleased you bring up this issue of the father, because I want to ask you more particularly about your book, but just to say first how Gandhi himself is so ambiguous about fatherhood. And, you know, we've made him into the father of the nation, but here is a man, well, his name, Mohandas, he's the devotee of the child god. His ideals of fatherhood are pretty scary. You know, Rama, who is willing to sacrifice his children and wife, Harishchandra, to do the same. Prahlad, who actually ends up approving of the killing of his own father. Whereas when Gandhi thinks about models, he thinks about children often, right? I mean, the child for him is the model, and in a way so is the slave. I mean, he completely reverses the usual project. But to return to your book, you know, Righteous Republic, it's a fascinating exercise in thinking about Indian republicanism with a history that is not the standard issue history of political thought in the West. But I wonder if you might say something about how certain Indian categories, and perhaps the Republic might be one of them, actually seem to exit history. Again, this is my own particular obsession, because it's difficult to see republicanism with a kind of genealogy in India, apart from the kind that you want to point out in your book. Is it possible, do you think, to suggest that certain things happen in Indian history that actually are so strikingly new, that were not unthought of, but that have no prehistory in India? I mean, if you think of if the Indian government state even today, yes, of course, India is a republic, but its system of government, others who are more qualified will correct me if I'm wrong, its system of government still remains one of a constitutional monarchy, right? This is not an American or French style presidential system. The president plays the role of a governor general, or of, dare I say it, a viceroy, not the vice-regal viceroys of the past. So can you tell us something about how the idea of the republic actually fits in or does not does it have an Indian prehistory, and what might someone like Gandhi have thought about it?
Well, I mean, I think India's political uniqueness lies in the fact that India is the product of a conversation between certain strains of Western political thought and a certain history of politics and of political power, which is indigenous to this part of the world. So there is a long pre-colonial history of how politics is done on the subcontinent. And that then comes into conversation with and into conflict with a lot of what Indians in the late 19th and the early 20th century are learning from, absorbing from, and resisting, in as much as it's coming from England and from Europe and from the Anglo-American world. So some of those elements of Western modernity are definitely absorbed into the Indian construction of its own modernity, of India's own modernity, and that includes the idea of a constitutional republic, the idea of a democracy, values like liberty and equality, the vote, fraternity, a certain state structure and its architecture. But that does not mean that people involved in this project of nationalism, of anti-colonial movements, of nation building, decolonization, are completely and suddenly divorced from or forgetful of real experiences of a historical kind that have affected all of their lives in living here in this part of the world. So there are memories of the Mughal Empire. There are memories which are older than that. There's a variety of different political traditions coming out of different regions in India. And there are different contestations for power which are actually unfolding even as the British Raj is ruling India. So all of those elements actually go into cobbling together something that is fairly new. And it's new in a good way, I think, because while you do have constitutional and republican models available from France or England or America or other parts of the world, they have never necessarily been made functional for such a large population or such a diverse population or for a set of cultures which have great antiquity and a great history of their own and a self-awareness about their own age and about their own sense of civilization with its own repertoire of values and norms. So making something work in a context is a very difficult thing, and I think it required a lot of creative thinking on the part of a number of people of our founding generations to actually free India from British rule and make it possible for it to move on its own path. And I try to explore, all of the ideas that go into that project, some of which are unsuccessful and not realized, practically speaking, but which are nevertheless there churning in the pot, for all of the time that is leading up to independence.
No, I think that one of the interesting things about your book is that you show how Indian democracy pushes the categories, the inherited categories of things like universal suffrage, democracy itself, rule of law, all the things we associate with a modern liberal state, to their limits and even beyond their limits, because none of these categories were ever conceived in the West of dealing with as vast, as complex a society as India. It would have been inconceivable to any of the founding figures of these, in my opinion. Richard will correct me if I'm wrong. But Charles, the Gandhi's famous or infamous criticism of lawyers and the law. Often scholars deal with it as a kind of critique of competitiveness, all right, and of the different interests that are created because of that. So, for instance, if Gandhi is seen as having said something of the following kind, that lawyers are there because they, make money off other people's troubles, and lawyers are interested, therefore, in getting people to disagree rather than to agree. And in doing this, what they do is to reinforce the position of the arbiter, who could be a lawyer, but which could also be the state itself. All right. So caste and communal differences, he argued, were intensified because of the claim of the British state to be the neutral arbiter between them. Right? It didn't allow people to directly address each other which they might do violently or non-violently. But in either case, they would be engaging each other directly. But this brings in, I think, the more important issue, which is that more than competitiveness and the commercial nature of law, Gandhi really disliked the mediating aspect of it. He doesn't like mediation. He would rather that people confront each other by fighting than to, have mediation imposed upon them. I wonder if you might say something about this what in conventional terms appears to be a really peculiar criticism of mediation.
Let me put up a framework before I directly respond to your question, if I might. If Gandhi had become the physician that he wanted to become when he was a teenager, instead of the lawyer that his family insisted that he become, we might not be sitting here today having this conversation. Gandhi spent 23 years in the study and practice of law. And my question was, when I began this project, what was the relationship between all of those years in the law and his turn to civil disobedience? I found 3 answers to that question. The first, it was his experiences as a practicing lawyer that turned Gandhi to civil disobedience. He's in South Africa. There's a large Indian community there. They are discriminated against by the British government, the colonial governments. And Gandhi insists on going to court to redress these grievances. And almost every time is turned away. His pleas for justice go unanswered. The answer from the courts in the legal system is no. That pushed him towards civil disobedience. The second thing that I found was that Gandhi used his practice of law as a stage for, we've already mentioned this, experimentation with regard to civil disobedience. He mentions it first in 1904 in the context of the locations question in the Transvaal. And he first experiments with it in a rather unorthodox way in 1906 in Johannesburg in a series of cases that are known as the tram car test cases. And he learns from these experiences. He learns about what makes civil disobedience effective and what makes it ineffective. And the third thing that I learned was that his experiences in the law provided him with an opportunity to integrate himself. And this is going to come now toward your question. When he arrives in South Africa, there's a very rigid division between his professional life on the one hand and his morality, his politics, his spirituality on the other. By the time he finishes his practice in South Africa, his experiences in the law have provided him with an opportunity to become integrated, such that his professional life and his politics and morality and spirituality are now all one. He's one person. I think that evolution led him, in part, to the vision partially expressed in Indian Home Rule of the ideal of village life and the ideal of community that would do away with the need for lawyers. Part of that doing away of the need for lawyers is what you suggest, which is the elimination of mediation and direct interpersonal discussion. Let me just conclude with this point. An American jurist named Oliver Wendell Holmes once famously said, "The life of the law is not logic. The life of the law is experience." And if ever that were true, it was true of Mohandas Gandhi.
If I might just continue on that a bit, to ask what remains of the lawyer in Gandhi after he becomes the Mahatma, because it strikes me when you look at the correspondence among his associates and indeed his enemies, especially his enemies, and between them and him, many of his enemies in particular always complain that, Gandhi works in the following: something we will agree on. I will accept your reading of this text, but I reserve the right to reinterpret it in future. Of course, the reinterpretation cannot be outrageous. It cannot be unfaithful to the text. It has to somehow cohere, but he's willing to actually set up the text, whether it's an agreement or a religious text like the Bhagavad Gita, or a constitutional text, and say, fine, we'll agree, but I reserve the right, without doing violence to the text, to get another kind of meaning out of it. And his enemies always see this as, this is Gandhi the lawyer, right? Here he is, you have a legal text and you niggle with it, and but it strikes me that this is in a way also the example of individual Swarajya, right? That you accept an authority, but you're unwilling to abdicate all responsibility to the authority. You must have something to do with it. I wonder, so it seems ambiguous to me. Is this Gandhi the niggling lawyer? Is this Gandhi the advocate of Swaraj? What's happening here?
Is this Gandhi the lawyer? Guilty as charged. There's no question that his training in the law and his practicing the law influenced the way he thought afterwards. Lawyers are trained to think in a certain way. They're trained to think in a very organized way, and they're also trained to think in ways that are fluid. And so I think that the fluidity that we see in his approach toward the question you raise is of one piece with something that Richard has been saying, which is that he is working out his philosophy, his truth on the public stage. And that means that there's give and take. That means there's pushing and shoving, and there are elbows being tossed around. It doesn't mean that he has a lack of fidelity to the original document. It means that he is open. If I could just add one other thing. In the last couple of years of his life as a lawyer, you see this played out vividly. He comes back from England, having written Indian Home Rule, and he's thinking about quitting law. But he can't make up his mind. And so he uses the public stage as a forum for ventilating his arguments, both in terms of his speeches about the law and about his casework. And so, again, I think that is of one piece with what Richard is saying with regard to how Gandhi works out his truth.
Richard, since you've been invoked twice now, I wonder if you might care to comment on whether Gandhi, can you think of Gandhi productively as a legal thinker or as a thinker within or of the law, or is there a kind of anarchist Gandhi who militates against this form of thinking?
Well, can you hear? Is it all right? My aunt Cornelia Sarabji had an interview with Gandhi, whose views she very much disliked. My book is trying to make amends to Gandhi to some little extent. And she started this interview by saying, now look, you and I are both lawyers, so we don't take offense and we'll speak frankly. And Gandhi's first reply was, no, 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 I've been disbarred from being a lawyer. I can't do the law anymore. And my aunt completely ignored this. So it was a contest between the sort of legal intellect of Cornelia and the assault of charm of Mahatma Gandhi. And it's hard to say who won because legally, my aunt won. There's no doubt about it. She won. But in terms of charm, she was absolutely defeated and nonplussed. She hadn't expected this charming treatment. She was used to extremely hostile males in the courtroom, and this man was charming to her. That was his weapon, and very, very powerful was the weapon of Gandhian love, as he said it was. So, not a lawyer in that case, anyhow.
Yeah, I'm reminded, Richard, by the story of your aunt defending an elephant when she first comes back from India, from England rather, to India. Someone who's had that level of experience, I suppose, is capable of dealing with Gandhi. But Ananya, I wonder if you can say something about, because you know your work is on Gandhi, the thinker whose world of references goes back much further. You know, he's able to grapple with what a great chunk of Indian history has given him. Could you say something about that Gandhi?
Well, just to connect to what all of you have been discussing, I think if the prerogative for interpretation, I mean, if you want to name that legalistic, then Gandhi exercised that to the bitter end. And a good example would be, his take on the Bhagavad Gita, right, which is something that I look at in great detail. And he reads this text continuously over the course of 40 years. He reads it privately, he reads it together with his associates in his ashram or in whatever sort of domestic setting he has. And in, eventually they publish a book called The Gita According to Gandhi. Now, in order to be able to say according to me, right, you are exercising a certain authority as an interpreter, as a reader, as a commentator. And Gandhi did that with confidence, because I think, for him the important thing was to get at the truth. And in order to do that, at some point you have to make certain interpretive leaps, you have to take certain interpretive risks. With dealing with any text, if you take the text seriously. And I think Gandhi did that, and he did that even earlier with Tolstoy or with Emerson or with Thoreau or with with the Christian texts that he was influenced by. I think both things are at work. There is the legalistic tendency to interpret, but there is also the assertion of the reader's freedom, which is also a kind of Swaraj. Because it's okay to do that in the service of arriving at the truth of the text, which is in the end what he's after. The fidelity is always to the truth, not to this or that position that has been, conventionally powerful or conventionally dominant. I think the aspects of Gandhi's thought that I've tried to explore a little bit have to do with his early exposure to Jainism, which come on account of him being a Gujarati, where Gujarati society has mixed Jain and Vaishnava elements. And there was a particular teacher whom he was close to in his youth called Raichand Bhai Mehta or Srimad Raj Chandra. So I think he had something that he learned and took from Jain thought about ahimsa. But paradoxically, the more interesting source for Gandhi's ahimsa, I think, is the Bhagavad Gita. And I say paradoxically because it's a text about the necessity to go into battle and to enter into a field of violence. And so why is it that Gandhi draws his lesson of non-violence from a text that is all about war and violence? That's the interesting kind of exercise that he manages to pull off. And I think without exercising his interpretive freedom as well as his tenacity in sticking with this text till he had gotten it, he would not have been able to come up with that kind of a reading, of a really original reading. And mind you, I mean, I don't want to take too much time, but there were a lot of people reading the Bhagavad Gita afresh. Tilak read it, and even Ambedkar read it, and many of the nationalist thinkers kind of went back to it because they felt like it had something to say to their particular political situation. So Gandhi was not unusual in that sense. He was part of a kind of whole moment of a resurgence in interest in the Bhagavad Gita as a source of political thought. But his, what he made of it was quite unique, I think.
Could we
Yes,
stay on
Charles.
this topic for a moment?
Yes, of course.
You mentioned, the notion of text and disagreement with regard. Gandhi had an experience in South Africa that scarred him with regard to texts. I'm sure you'll recall this. The Indians are refusing to register as the Transvaal government had wanted them to do. And Gandhi goes to jail and stays in jail for some time in January of 1908, and eventually reaches an agreement with the colonial government, which is not reduced to a single text, as a result of which the government was free to repudiate the agreement, and Gandhi had to restart the movement. And that scarred him. That was what I call malpractice. I mean, it's what a first-year law student should know to do, reduce the agreement to a single text. And so I think his having been hurt by that failure influenced the way he looked at texts from then on. It certainly played a role in the Gandhi-Irwin conversations, but the larger point, I think, is that afterwards he wanted a text, and he wanted to own the text. He wanted to be his text.
My Cambridge colleague, Shruti Kapila, has written actually very finely about this and about the, Gandhi's idea of voluntary obedience, of refusing to do something but agreeing to do it by a kind of an understanding with the colonial government in this sense, and a voluntary subordination of oneself in a sacrificial way, which therefore takes back the agency, and completely confuses the line between disobedience and obedience. I mean, he's so interesting that way. But in the little time we...
Should I ask a question to Ananya?
I do, but I also would like you to say something to Ananya about, the point she made about the Jains, because in your book, of course, you talk about how Gandhi explicitly rejects a certain kind of inheritance.
I'd be interested to know what you think, if you don't mind my asking you, Ananya. I very much agreed with what you said about the importance of the phrase, the Gita according to Gandhi. I think Perry Anderson misunderstood that. He quoted a similar phrase. Gandhi said, I believe I always speak the truth according to me. And Perry Anderson thinks this is another example of the shifty fellow. No, but it's not. He's just explaining the very point you made, that Gandhi is always interpreting a text. But there is one thing on which I took a different view from you, so I'd like to know what you'd say. On my view, Gandhi said something very surprising. He said he hated the Indian view of nonviolence, that he started off as a devotee of violence because he thought the Indian view was that it's perfectly all right if you tread on a beetle. The only bad thing is if I tread on a beetle, because then I'll have done the wrong thing. If you do the thing, that's fine. We don't care about the beetle. There's no compassion at all. And he said it was only when he read Tolstoy that non-violence is an ocean of compassion that he became a devotee of non-violence. And just going along with that, about the Bhagavad Gita in particular, he said that he could, of course he could take the story of a very violent battle, as a central spiritual text, because that text does not even discuss non-violence. It's never occurred to the warrior Arjuna that anybody might be non-violent. It's his dharma to be violent. The only question discussed, says Gandhi, is whether one should make an exception for one's relatives. That's the only issue, to which the answer is certainly not. Now, I know Gandhi said many things, and I may just have noticed two things he said, but obviously there's two different interpretations of Gandhi here. One saying he's not drawing on the Bhagavad Gita, he's not drawing on Indians at all, he's drawing on a Christian, Tolstoy, and then there's yours, which I was very grateful for your knowledge of Indian background thought, and on Ambedkar I simply gratefully learnt from you, but I realized on Gandhi our interpretations were different. I took him not to be drawing on Indian thought. But now, do you think I've got that wrong?
Well, I mean, you know, I have a long reading of Gandhi reading the Gita, which I don't think this would be the right place to revisit that in its fullness. But I think the reason for his devotion to the Gita is that it helps him to clarify what correct action is in a situation of moral dilemma. And the dilemma could indeed be between violence and non-violence. Or very broadly put, the right thing and the wrong thing. It helps him to clarify, you know, how you arrive at what correct action is, and to cultivate the state of mind that permits you to go through with that form of action that you have identified as being correct, despite all obstacles, right? So it's really a form of being alert and active and engaged with the difficulty of your situation that Gandhi is after. And I think his reading of the Gita allows him to fine-tune that to the very sort of, you know, to perfection. So that by the time, and you know, you said that you felt that there were all kinds of inconsistencies that entered into him in the last few years of his life in the 1940s, but actually it's really around partition and the violence of partition that Gandhi has to take some of his most difficult stands and to act in ways that are often seemingly completely counterintuitive, and that go against the grain of history as it is being made and as it is unfolding. But he's able to do that with a certain clarity because he has already spent the preceding 4 decades thinking about what the Gita has to teach him. Otherwise he cannot be Noakhali, right? He cannot reject the terms on which India and Pakistan become independent nation states. He cannot take the kind of stand that he takes on communal violence. And he cannot sort of distance himself from the Congress and everything that the freedom movement has fought for at the very moment of its achievement. You know, he is only able to say no because he has by now understood where he stands vis-a-vis right action, right? And the true meaning of non-violence as regards to action or the choice between 2 kinds of action. So I think that that very finessing of his morality is something that he achieves through this continuous engagement with a text like the Gita.
Richard, sorry to interrupt, but we must open up for questions. Yes, gentleman at the back in the blue check shirt.
This constant reworking that Gandhi seems to be doing, you put it in his readings, you put it into the context of law and him being a lawyer. To me it sounds very almost Hegelian or dialectic. Did he have any contact with working out things in a dialectical way? Because it sounds like he's doing that. He's taking two opposites, making something new that is not quite related to them. It sounds very much like Hegel to me, but...
Richard, perhaps you should.
I am not aware, but somebody else may inform me of his... oh, sorry. I'm not aware, but somebody else may be able to inform me of his following Hegel's dialectic. Of course, Socrates was dialectical, but less dialectical in the Apology, which is what Gandhi paraphrased, because that's one work in which he is trying to set out what he believes to the jury who will condemn him to death. So in the Apology, which Gandhi paraphrased, he's not being so dialectical and argumentative. He really is expressing the views he believes. So I'm not aware of Gandhi following dialectical philosophy. Somebody may correct me.
Yes.
My question is to Mr. Richard. You said that Gandhiji's philosophy of non-violence was not absolute, in the sense that he compared it with what is being let go of, like where violence is something which is of a better existence, like it will result in something better. Gandhiji supported it. Is that what you meant when you said that his thoughts on stray dogs, for example, the ones who were killed? So, like, are you trying to imply that his thought on non-violence was not absolute? It was like subjective to the fact that if it's better to be violent, then so be it. If that is the case, then why didn't he choose the violent way to get independence? Because I think that would have been a better option.
Was that for Professor Sorabji?
I think Gandhi thought non-violence was extremely active. It would require you to protect somebody from assault by interposing your own body. Non-violence takes far more courage. It's not that I'm ignoring, I don't think he was ignoring the courage that the military life requires, storming a position with your men, protecting your mates and so on. It takes courage, of course. But to be completely alone and not to resist in any way takes enormous courage. To think of that as passive somehow, I think it takes a higher level of courage, even than the military one, because you don't have the support of thinking, well, I must help my mates and they're helping me. I feel that's incredibly active.
Was there a question here where you were standing?
I have a question.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Can I go first? Yeah. Okay, for me, I was reading Swaraj, Miss Swaraj, a few days ago, and it struck me that right in the beginning, when there's a publisher and editor so on having a dialogue, Gandhi establishes that the Varna system is not negotiable. The only thing is you should find dignity and equality within the Varna system. I think this is the most controversial part of the reading of Gita, and which also put him in direct conflict with Ambedkar. And I wonder why he did not engage with Buddhism as he did with Christianity in terms of compassion and so on. Finally, Amartya Sen offers a contrary view again to the reading of the Gita. And he says, how can somebody interpret Gita as a lesson in non-violence, as speakers have spoken? And he and many Buddhist philosophers, professor in I forget his name, anyway, they say that actually Arjun's hesitation and doubt is much more profound by questioning this whole idea of annihilation, of destroying everything. And there's another model in the Indian tradition of Buddha, a Kshatriya who did not follow his Varna Dharma and went the other path. Thank you.
Ananya, I think you are best placed to answer that. And Ambedkar and Gandhi in particular.
Well, I'm sorry, sir. I couldn't hear a lot of what you said. But broadly, I mean, just based on what I could hear, I think you were asking about why there wasn't, why Gandhi didn't turn to Buddhism in any interesting way, while Ambedkar did. I think, I mean, this is something that I've discussed at great length in my book, which I would invite you to read. You know, different resources, let's say, within the repertoire of tradition are engaged to different extents by different modern thinkers. Ambedkar turns in a very interesting way to Buddhism towards the end of his life before he converts to Buddhism and creates a new school of Buddhism. Gandhi has a similar engagement, an analogous engagement to different ends with the Bhagavad Gita. On the issue of you know, where the two thinkers stand relative to each other on caste or on varnashram dharma, I mean, I think that's you know, a very big point of difference between them, and it's a very big source of continuing conflict in different streams of thought in India even today. So I mean, we can discuss that at length, you know. But right now we're I think the panel is in general focused on Gandhi. So perhaps putting him into conversation with some other thinker in this context is something that, you know, we'll just have to wait for some other discussion.
Let's have a last question, gentleman here.
Sir, this is a question, I think, and either right here in the center, please.
Yes, please be brief because we have.
Sure. So my question actually stems from what Richard just mentioned at the beginning of Gandhi's morality around. Sorry, is that better? Yeah, around his thinking that choosing violence or non-violence is actually an individual goal of what you actually believe in, and you essentially attribute that to the Stoic thinking. And then Ananya talks about his reading of the Gita and the impression around that. The question that I have for you is do you actually attribute it to the typical dharam sankat, which is what the Gita is about, around your choices as an individual, or do you actually align into the Stoic thinking of a different way of addressing that problem? So which do you believe is the primary driver of the way Gandhi thinks around that? As per you guys.
Thank you, that's a wonderful question. Can we just take the last one here and then answer both?
Yeah. One string that actually connects all four of you and your thoughts, that string comes from your raising the debate in a philosophical sense about consistency and inconsistencies in Gandhi. And you, sir, you talked about Stoicism, which actually, if we talk about Raichand Bhai and his influences on Jainism and Vaishnavism, we see consistent Stoic approach of Gandhi's reading of Indian tradition, reinterpreting Indian tradition in Stoicism terms. Your context of placing Gandhi in a project where you actually are trying to show a consistency of his nation building project is actually, in fact, your book review I have read, I have not read your book, is actually not taking into account the fact of language of politics, which connects to his point. As a lawyer, if you read Gandhi 100 volumes, 108 volumes, and the rest of it, each sentence, each paragraph is of a lawyer. His engagement with Jinnah, his engagement with the Irwin Pact, his engagement with Ambedkar, each sentence, each word is of a lawyer.
Could you, sorry to interrupt, it's an excellent set of points, but if you could just come to a question because we have to clear.
My question is that to bring all of you together, I would really see the consistency or inconsistency not as a benchmark of a great philosopher or a great mind.
Two excellent sets of comments and questions, and we have, of course, only a few seconds to answer them. Could I just have you very briefly say at least one thing about both?
I will say this briefly, that Gandhi uses his legal practice to work out his philosophy and his practice of civil disobedience, which of course is a narrower category than nonviolence. But I would add one other thing, and that's something we haven't discussed yet, and I regret that unfortunately we don't have time to do it, and that is the role of suffering in creating social change in the context of civil disobedience. I think this is a major part of Gandhi's thinking about nonviolence that deserves a lot more attention, and unfortunately we've not been able to give it this afternoon.
Ananya?
I just wanted to go back to the question that was asked about the dialectical method. I don't see the gentleman who asked it, but I think if you read Hind Swaraj carefully, or even cursorily, you notice the structure of a dialogue that is set up in it between an imaginary reader and an imaginary editor. And Gandhi assumes these two voices, and the entire book is written as a set of questions and answers and debates between these two imaginary characters. So I think Gandhi liked the dialectical method. I'm not sure I would go so far as to call it Hegelian, but he took full advantage of the again, a legalistic setting of having a debate between 2 points of view, a point and a counterpoint, which helped him to push home his arguments. And that's really masterfully displayed in Hind Swaraj.
Richard.
Just on consistency, there's a passage where Gandhi says, consistency is the obsession of small minds. And then he goes on to say, and I jolly well was consistent.
Well, with that...
I didn't actually quite hear the question on it's worse to go against your beliefs. Will you repeat it to me, or
perhaps we should, since I'm being warned, so perhaps we should end with that wonderfully pithy response, Richard. Thank you all for attending, and please thank our